So next we're going to take a look at the 34th President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. Again, we have 5 criteria we use as guideposts: growth, finances, international politics, war and security, and the most important, to leave the country better or worse than they found it. Kennedy is very difficult to evaluate because I think anyone looking at him acknowledges that his presidency is absolutely a pivot point in American history, that a lot of things before and after were very, very different because of his decisions. But at the same time, he served for less than a full term. People forget that a lot of the accomplishments that they put on him actually happened under Johnson. A lot of the blame for things that, if you want to be negative with regards to particularly foreign policy, were things that were put in place before him and that continued on with him. So as I'm looking at his presidency, I think that's something that's very difficult for people to assess. And I could see people completely disagreeing with me because they blame Johnson or Eisenhower for something, or completely disagreeing with me because they think I'm giving Kennedy too much credit for something that was accomplished by someone else. I also think that the mystique around the Kennedy name really makes it difficult to have an honest assessment of him. And I'm trying to remove any of the soap opera politics around the Kennedy name, either before or after, because it wasn't really relevant during the time of his presidency. It wasn't something that directly affected him. Yes, the Jackie O mystique and aura around him certainly helped his presidency with a certain kind of charisma, but I don't know how much of that was actually there at the time and how much of it is kind of revisionist history because of his assassination. So let's start in terms of growth. And this is the area I think you can give him the most credit for, particularly with regards to the civil rights movement. He really took a big step forward from Eisenhower. Yes, the desegregation laws passed under Eisenhower, but Kennedy was the one willing to, go forth and implement them, to the point that he sent federal troops, got into his arguments with George Wallace and many of the Southern leaders, really took a stand that had not happened since Reconstruction, as far as the federal government deciding that it was going to actively work toward the rights of African Americans. No, he wasn't perfect on it, and that's part of why the March on Washington happened, was because people wanted more. But he did create a large amount of hope, which is why the March on Washington happened. People believed that things could change and that change was coming, and they wanted to keep pushing him on change. And I think he was going in the right direction, and I think that was something Eisenhower wasn't doing. And so that's something you have to absolutely give Kennedy credit for, and I think that was a big step forward. He also did similar things with regards to women's rights, the Equal Rights Amendment. Obviously, these are things where he was trying to include more people in the economy, in the country, and just being participants and not second-class citizens. I think that was very positive in terms of growing the country. In terms of technology, additionally, the Apollo program and the New Frontier program, a lot of these were continuations of what Eisenhower had started, but he did continue on and he did push forward. So I think all of those are very positive things with regards to growth. The Peace Corps, I think, was a very positive decision, but we'll kind of get to some of the concerns with regards to international politics. That moves us next to finances, and finances is much more of a mixed bag. He was the first president to have a budget that was over $100 billion. He was one of the only presidents to have budget deficits. One of the first presidents, I wouldn't say only, because this got to be a regular thing, and it's currently a regular thing. Up to this point, presidents having deficits when there wasn't a recession or a war was kind of a negative. Kennedy kind of ignored the entire Eisenhower worry about the military-industrial complex and just blew past it. He was very much a Keynesian who believed in spending for growth, and his spending was high. So there were some financial balance problems that he had, but I don't think you would say that the economy was bad during his time. Again, he didn't have a full term, so maybe you could say negatively or positively, but I don't think I'd put him in the top half of finances because he obviously didn't balance the budget, but I don't think I'd put him in the bottom half either because the economy didn't collapse under him. The area that I would be most critical of Kennedy would be international politics. People talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I talk about the Bay of Pigs and the leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis and how tense it was. I think if international politics are going well, we shouldn't even hear about the threat of nuclear war. I don't think that the fact that the Russians folded changes the fact that we had gotten to the point where they were that close to war, where war was that dangerous. I think that's a negative on him. And again, started by his failure with the Bay of Pigs. You can say Eisenhower started that. I don't disagree with you. He continued it on. I would make a similar argument with regards to Vietnam. Yes, Eisenhower was the one who kind of stepped in it. Maybe you could argue, well, I'd say Eisenhower, who kind of stepped in it when the French were realizing that we had to get out of there and the decolonization, and we were trying to step into the fold and supporting a unpopular dictator. But I think the fact that the unpopular dictator in Vietnam was Catholic led Kennedy initially to go further. led the guy to believe he had more support. And then when Kennedy allowed the coup to proceed, we didn't have a fallback plan or option. And I think that entanglement is really what Johnson inherited. Now, we'll talk about Johnson when we get to Johnson. I'm not saying Johnson's inheritance of Vietnam was handled well. Certainly, he expanded that. But Kennedy's actions and inactions, both on both directions, really made that a much more complicated situation. Similarly, his support of the Ba'ath forces in Iraq, which would eventually lead to the Ba'ath raising in the long term folks like Saddam Hussein. Obviously, not a positive in the long term of American politics. The failures in the Congo. You could go on and on with regards to Kennedy just not doing a very good job of navigating international politics. Latin America, there was a number of assassinations of left-leaning leaders. Did Eisenhower start most of this? Yes. And I criticized Eisenhower before. Kennedy did it more and did it worse in almost every regard and respect. The Berlin Wall was built on his watch, which I don't, can't necessarily blame him for that. But again, it was another moment where we were increasing the tension of the Cold War. We were getting to the point where it became dangerous, again, with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so I don't think I'm going to give Kennedy a very high marks with regards to international politics, even with the Peace Corps, which I do think overall was a very positive action. In terms of war and security, again, a mixed bag because of the failure of the Bay of Pigs, because of the expansion of the Vietnam War, because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because of even some of the riots that were taking place at home. Although I think those were necessary riots. I don't give him criticism for that, sending troops to the South and really being aware that you're not going to let, Jim Crow's just not going to go away without some active move by the federal government to enforce the law, to enforce desegregation. That was necessary, so I don't even blame him for those riots and that civil disturbance. It was kind of a necessary thing to do. But I do think he did increase the tensions in the Cold War. I don't think his time period is when we look back on as going, okay, things got a little bit calmer. I'm not going to say he's near the bottom. I'm not going to say he's even in, I would say he's probably right around the middle, maybe even slightly above the bottom half, because we've had so many bad presidents. But I'm not saying that because he did a good job. I'm just saying there were a lot worse presidents that we've had so far. That brings us to the most important criteria, of course. Did they leave the country better or worse? And in this instance, I think I would argue very strongly that Kennedy left the country far better than he found it. Not to say that Eisenhower left the country in a difficult spot or a bad spot, but I don't think Eisenhower was pushing hard enough on civil rights. I think there were a lot of things that Eisenhower was doing that were positive, but not nearly strong enough, and he didn't take the stances that he needed to really move things. He was a little too stagnant. And Kennedy was bold in those choices, and he was bold in setting up the civil rights legislation, in terms of the 24th Amendment to get rid of poll taxes. He was a lot more aggressive in the time that aggression was needed. Now, we could play the counterfactual game of what would happen if Kennedy had survived, if he hadn't been assassinated. Would he have done the same thing LBJ did, or would he have done worse? Would he have done better? I'm not one who really thinks that things would have gone all that differently in terms of intent with Kennedy rather than LBJ. I actually think LBJ should get a lot of credit for moving Kennedy's, at that point, stagnant agenda through, pushing both in terms of the civil rights legislation. People also forget the tax laws that were changed that Kennedy had been pushing and that had not been able to get over the hump. Now, some of that is because Kennedy was assassinated, and Lyndon Johnson used the leverage of that. He's very LBJ. There's no other way to describe it. If he has an advantage tactically and politically, he will use it. And the death of Kennedy, the number of times he cited Kennedy, the first speeches that he gave, all pointed to Kennedy as we need to have his legacy put forward. These were policies brought and created by Kennedy that Johnson pushed forward. Yes, Johnson was the one who ended up getting them done, and we'll talk about that when we get to Johnson. And maybe they wouldn't have got done if Kennedy had stayed in power. But they did get done, and they were things that Kennedy wanted to happen. And so I think Kennedy deserves a lot of credit for that. And I think that's one of the reasons he's so well remembered, particularly by African Americans, because up to that point, it hadn't had a champion who was really pushing that hard. Again, a flawed champion, but comparing to him to what we had before, night and day on many of these issues. So where does that put him overall? I don't think he's a top 10 president. I think his international politics were very weak, and I think his finances weren't particularly strong, so I'm not going to put him in the top 10. I do think he is better than the presidents that we had in the Gilded Age. I think he is an above average president. I think I'm going to put him right below Ulysses S. Grant at number 12. I think that's a good spot for him. I think Grant was a person who, even if he was less successful with regards to Reconstruction because of the hand that he was dealt, I think they were both people who were pushing very hard to have changes happen. I think Grant's presidency was more productive in a lot of ways, and I think Kennedy's international politics issues really knock him down. Again, maybe I'm someone who's looking at this as much more negative, but if you look at the foreign policy decisions and how they haunted America for decades to come, I mean, honestly, the Iraq War up till up to, I mean 2000, the mid 2000s, we were still dealing with Saddam Hussein. And although he wasn't directly coming in the first wave of the Ba'ath Party, that is the path that brought us to the dictatorships that we had to deal with later. So, keeping that in mind, I'm going to put him at number 12.